Hey folks, before we get started, I just wanted to tell you, you can unlock unlimited access to political news, commentary, opinion, and a whole lot more at inforum.news/port for only 99 cents a month for your first 3 months. Hurry, get this limited time offer at inforum.news/port now. This podcast is brought to you by the North Dakota Petroleum Foundation. From heating our homes, empowering our vehicles, to cell phones, clothing, and medical equipment, oil and natural gas makes everyday life better. North Dakota Oil and Natural Gas, advancing the possibilities. Learn more at ndpetroleumfoundation.org. Welcome to Plain Talk, and I got to tell you, as we head into a midterm election year, what's on the minds of a lot of Americans is the economy. There's a lot going on. Inflation's a challenge right now. We have workforce shortages. Fuel prices are up, which is part of the inflation issue, but it's also part of a natural resource issue as well. All of these things are going on. They're weighing on our minds. So maybe it's a good thing that we have a Nobel laureate, a man who won the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences in 2002 for his pioneering work in experimental economics. According to the Nobel Prize Committee, he was selected for, and I quote, having established laboratory experiments as a tool in empirical economic analysis, especially in the study of alternative market mechanisms. I'm talking about Dr. Vernon Smith, who, by the way, tomorrow, he's on the North Dakota State University campus. Tomorrow, he will be giving a talk that is sponsored by the Sheila and Robert Challey Institute for Global Innovation and Growth. If you go to ndsu.edu/Challey Institute, that's CHALLEY Institute, they have all the information and how you could participate in that. I'm sure if you Google Challey Institute NDSU, you can get there as well. Dr. Smith, thanks for your time today.
Well, it's great to be here, Rob, and well, I don't know. I think the current economy, I think, is something I can speak to, but from my experience in the Second World War. It's very similar.
Really? In what way?
Yes, we had, 1941 to 46. We had 5 years in which there was a moratorium on the construction of homes. Okay, so there's no new homes were built. And we've had 2 years where you see construction has been way down because of the COVID, or recent 2 years. So you couldn't build homes. A lot of goods were scarce. And of course, we've seen supply interruptions the last couple of years that produced some scarcity. But savings was quite high during the Second World War, and our savings, in particular, they really surged in March and April of 2020, so the situation is very similar. And indeed, at the end of the war, we had inflation, because this backlog of savings was coming into markets. Goods were scarce for a while. Markets responded very quickly, and of course, as firms converted from war production to peacetime stuff, we were starting to get lots of goods, and so it was a prosperous period, but not without inflation.
It seems to me a difference now between now and that period is our supply lines. They're a heck of a lot longer today than they were back then, which I think in some ways, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression is one of the difficulties in coming out of the moment that you're talking about is the fact that our supply lines are so much longer and reach into other countries. We made a lot more stuff within the United States in the 1940s and 1950s than we do today. And that seems like a very complicating factor right now.
Well, yes, it is. And moreover, what's happened over time is that those supply lines have become very very well coordinated, you see, through all of the artificial intelligence and the aids that, people have. And, well, if you're very well, the better coordinated you are, the less inventories you need at each stage. and if you think about it, you see, inventories are buffers against shocks in demand or supply, and they pick up the slack. Well, but we now have a lot more just-in-time production.
That was Walmart's great innovation in retail, right? Yeah. Was the just-in-time delivery. Yeah. They were trying. Their goal was to have the new item coming in the back door as the last item in stock was going out the front door.
Exactly.
They didn't want to have any inventory at all. They wanted just enough what they needed, because from their point of view, in looking at their reliable supply lines, from their point of view, the inventory was just costing them money.
Right, and in fact that helped to keep goods cheaper, you see, for the consumer, this innovation. And but we've seen that a shock to that, you see, without the buffers all through the system. And I think that is an important difference. You're absolutely correct, between the current situation and the Second World War. That detail is really an important detail difference. Although the general framework, you see, people were building up assets, saving during the Second World War, just as they were the last couple of years. And that stuff's come into the market and produced the inflation, and then this added supply shock. That I think, this has led to some learning, I'm sure, on the part of businesses on how, because if this happens again, they'd like to be better prepared for it. Because you leave money on the table by doing this, by missing out on sales.
It almost seems like we might have to rethink some of those, again, some of the innovation, like the major innovations that companies like Walmart and Amazon and that brought us over the last 20, 30, 40 years. In some ways, would you say almost have to be reversed and undone? And maybe not entirely reversed is maybe the wrong word, but they need to be rethought, I think, is the argument you're making.
Well, and I'm sure these issues are being discussed almost as we speak, and have been, because business lives in a very dynamic environment day to day, and they, there's constant adjustment, and they're always looking for ways to economize, because that's where the money is. That's where the profit is, and at the same time, entering competition tends to limit the extent to which, you see, they can that you can. The profits at least needn't last very long if you have competitors coming in to limit it. But it's terribly interesting times.
One thing I wanted to ask you about, a lot of your research, and I'm reading from the press release sent out by the Challey Institute about your talk, but you've looked not just at the efficiency of markets, but also basic elements of human nature, such as trust and empathy and love. And I'm really interested in what that means, because I'm a political guy, and in my arena, one of the things that has been a challenge, and I think a worrying development, is how Americans are losing faith in some of the most important institutions in our society. They've lost faith in the news media, which is the industry I work in. They've lost faith in some ways in academia. When you look at or the fight over things like vaccines and what we just came through with the pandemic, there's not a lot of trust in society right now. So can you speak to that? Like, how is your research?
Well, yes, and I tell you, where trust is really important in markets, and this is not visible, I think, to everyone, is that they Trust means that a lot of the laws, for example, against theft and robbery are self-enforcing. People just don't do it. Okay,
I always like to argue that we have laws against things, but for the most part, there aren't enough police to protect you from everybody. For
no,
the most part,
you can't have a policeman on every
right.
corner. Come on, it works because there's voluntary compliance.
Most of us don't get robbed because most of us aren't robbers.
Exactly, and it comes from it comes right in terms of people kind of basically knowing what's right, and not committing wrongs, and being and it's what Adam Smith called self-command. I love that word, self-command. It's different than self-control or self-management. And Adam Smith, this is not in The Wealth of Nations. This is in his first book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. His model of why society works is that starting around the time we go to school, in his age, you start to have playfellows. And your playfellows, as he puts it, are not as indulgent as your parents in terms of dealing with your anger and your outbursts. And he says that's when we enter the great school of self-command, where we learn to follow rules and enable us to get along with our neighbors, you see. And he points out that one can scarce live long enough not to continue to learn in that school. And so that's his fundamental model of human sociability. And think about that. That fits into the whole ideas of freedom. You see, a free society composed of people who basically treat each other with respect, most of the time in a neighborly way, you see, is the thing that enables law-abiding citizens to comply with good rules, and you don't have to constantly enforce. You just have to have an enforcement mechanism, because there's people will push that boundary beyond any reason, and so we have a means of dealing with them, and that's where the police come in important. And of course we've had episodes of outrage against police because of a number of infractions of people's rights, ordinary rights, by police officers. And although that may be a very small number of police officers, nevertheless, it's ignited a lot of populist kind of outrage over that. But I think, to me, most of these populist outbursts, there's not really anything coming from the bottom to fuel those and continue them in the way that we have this in free nations like ours with constitutions. We have a large scale broad-based commitment to rule following behavior. And I think this is why we have these episodes, of course, and this is not the first one. I mean, we lived through a really difficult period over 100 years ago, from 1860 to 1870. We had a bitter civil war, and in fact, out of that war, we didn't even get we didn't succeed in extending rights to blacks that anything like what we now enjoy. You see, that was very much delayed. It really wasn't until Brown versus Topeka in 1954 that we had a confrontation that led to a major kind of a sea change in the acceptance of minorities like blacks, Hispanics, and Asians.
Well, let's bring it into the modern time, because talking about like rules and people deciding I think we saw a lot of that during the pandemic, where you could look over at, say, like a Switzerland, which I think has a very high trust society, and they didn't really have a lot of the furor over pandemic era restrictions, masking, things like that we saw here in the United States. And in the United States, in some parts of our country, we saw just a flat out, I don't know what you want to call it, almost a rebellion against certain types of pandemic, whether it's a mask mandate or business restrictions or whatever. Why is that happening in the United States? Is it an isolated thing, or is it symbolic of something larger? In my line of work in politics, we always like to extrapolate from everything into larger narratives, right? Even whether that's warranted or not. So, from your point of view, what's going on with that?
Well, I think a lot of the tension was coming from the COVID-19 contagion and fear of it. There was a similar period in the First World War with the Spanish flu. You see, there were riots then in the northern cities. They were a different character than they are now, but these were white mobs attacking black immigrants that moved from the south into the north. And during the war, First World War, there was a lot of migration north because a lot of the young men were off fighting in Europe, and there was a shortage of jobs. And so you had a migration from the south, and with many black families, you see, moving up into Chicago and Detroit and these areas. And there were white communities that feared that migration, and blacks were blamed for spreading the Spanish flu. Well, of course, they probably was, because they're migrating, but you had to say, I think there's a lot of parallels there that are interesting in comparison, but we went back to a more normal period. And families were touched very much by the Spanish flu. My father's had a sister who died of the Spanish flu. She was 18 years old in 1918. So kind of give you, and so that there was a young person. Well, almost every family, you see, was impacted by that. Well, the same thing is true, I think, in the COVID. People knew people that were very sick and died.
It creates a lot of emotion around it.
Yes.
Yeah. I want to switch tracks on you a little bit, and I think this gets into maybe a lot of the issues with inflation and that we're dealing with right now. You did a lot of work in the area of natural resources, and obviously here in North Dakota, that's a big deal. We're all about natural resources here, whether it's agriculture, whether it's energy. Gas prices are a big deal right now, and on the political stage, the debate seems to be, well, to lower gas prices, we need the federal government to allow more production. And I think on the Democratic side, you're hearing a lot of arguments saying, well, the problem is you have these companies that they can produce plenty of oil. They're just not, because they're trying to run up prices. That's sort of the political debate right now. Can you shed some light on that for us? What's going on?
Well, I think the cancellation of the Keystone pipeline, which was more than anything a symbol, I think, that we're going to throw more political support into environmental issues than we are the production of oil and gas. I think that's when I think really these prices, futures markets, started to take off, even though Albertan oil is coming in by train. It's getting here. It's coming in by tank cars, which of course is far more dangerous
and more expensive.
More expensive than the pipeline. In a way, you see, if you look at it that way, well, you really see how the what a mistake that was. I think in terms of a signal that we're going to become more dependent on importation. That we're back to the stage where we're more dependent on the importation of energy products, and and of course things like gasoline and food are not in the basic stuff are not in the CPI. And the reason is, it's interesting. People don't put those in the CPI because they're too volatile. They that is economists that work for they want a fairly steady measure.
Yeah.
In the CPI, you see, of change.
And yet out here in the real world, we're all still buying groceries and fuel. So.
Well, yeah, you see, and the models, you see, the economic forecasting models, they don't have assets in them, because if you put assets in them, things like housing and this sort of thing, then it's much more volatile, and also that means there's more missed forecasts. If most of the time things don't change very much, you're pretty good at forecasting, right? And so there's all of these, I think, pressures on public officials, and the monetary authorities always seem to be they appear to be the last to learn. They weren't forecasting this inflation, and the monetary authorities were quiet about it. Well, that's because people in public positions fear that what they say may itself affect what happens.
The self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, self-fulfilling, and so they don't want to go there. And so as a result, they appear to lag behind. Well, not necessarily. They may. I think they badly missed, of course, the Great Recession, because they really weren't. They didn't really believe that housing markets could be that important. And
let me bring you back to the energy question, because you said that the cancellation of Keystone was a symbol. And is that, I take that when you say that as the new administration comes in, the first thing they do is they cancel Keystone Pipeline. That signals to the oil and gas industry, your investments in further production may not be safe under this administration, because they're in I guess for lack of a better term, a hostile mood towards oil and gas development. So when prices go high, you see what I'm seeing is reticence in the oil and gas industry to invest, because the political situation is not favorable to them right now.
Rob, you've got it just right. I don't know that I can add anything to that. No, I quite agree. I think that's a good reading of what's going on. And that means high gas prices and a lot of energy-intensive goods. Those costs will spill into those goods, and those prices will go up also.
Well, that's kind of the thing is oil underlies everything else in the economy. I mean, if it's transportation, it's manufacturing, it's all of it. I mean, when oil prices go up, it costs more to get the goods on the shelves. I mean, that's the reality we're living with.
Well, Rob, and worldwide, cheap energy is the solution to poverty. You see, the countries that have been coming out of poverty and doing better are doing it because they have cheap energy available. So that you have really a conflict here directly between the reduction of poverty and investment in reduced carbon emissions. And I think, of course, I have written on climate issues, and a lot of people, what they don't realize is that we've had climate warming for the last 12,000 years, actually about 18,000 years. During this warming, we've had a warming period. Sea level rise has been enormous over the last 18 to 20,000 years, and I don't see that reversing. You see, and it's because of basic climate changes, and which is what we contribute to that is indeed quite small in the last since the 1970s. You see, is when there's been this concern about global warming due to human.
I wanted to ask you about that, because when I talk to some of my environmentalist friends, we end up talking about, energy issues and climate change and fuel prices and all that stuff. We end up talking a lot about externalities and the difficulties in. And I remember this anecdote from Milt Friedman. I think he was talking on a PBS program years and years ago, and was said that if you're in the business of changing oils, right, you do oil changes, you could undercut your competitors if you just dump the oil in a pond in the back, right? But we can't let people do that. That's obviously an irresponsible thing to do. So I thought that kind of illustrated the problems in, carbon emissions as a practical matter of economics don't really matter to someone operating a coal plant unless you make them matter. Yeah. And so explain to me, how do we struggle with these? Because I think we don't want a polluted environment. That's obviously. But on the other hand, how do you bring that in so that we're not distorting our economics to the point where it's hurting us?
Well, I think it's an overwhelming problem without a major breakthrough in energy efficiency. You see, and I think whereby we can get more for less in terms of carbon emissions, and I was part of Bjorn Lundberg's Copenhagen Consensus meetings. I've been to several of those. Doug North, the economic historian, and other people were involved with me in that, and we looked carefully. We heard a lot of position papers on the environmental issues, but we just couldn't bring ourselves to giving that very high priority when you have world nutrition problems. At that time, particularly nutrition problems among children in foreign countries, an inability in a lot of areas. There was not you didn't have clinics where children can be brought in and be vaccinated. There were all kinds of problems that we saw that were far more manageable and that could be solved, that made the climate thing look just we were not able to rate climate issues very high, you see, in our priority listing, and this was basically the reason, because it's such an enormous challenge, and also so many of the warming issues being of a long-term change that are beyond what we can control, you see, in any meaningful way.
Last question. I've been kind of the opinion that we need to be more reliant on human ingenuity. Like I feel like humans are so intelligent across the globe. We're coming up with better ways of doing things all the time, and sometimes it feels like the answer to the climate stuff is we've got to crack down on human ingenuity. We've got to do less. And I'm not so sure the answer isn't we got to do more. We got to figure out better ways of doing it.
I quite agree, and that's the reason why our panel came out in the form of support for more research. But even that, you see, really has to come from the bottom, not really the top. It's important that there be funding and financial support for ideas that come forward. But I quite agree that it's got to come. Almost all of our progress is coming from individuals, you see, who are thinking completely outside the box, or discovering things maybe accidentally that are outside of the box. and that's our history, and that's very important. And of course, it's the thing that free societies can do, you see, and make a contribution to.
Well, Dr. Smith, I appreciate you making time for me. Once again, your speech is going to be tomorrow. If you go to ndsu.edu/Challey Institute, ChalleyInstitute. That's all one word. It's a URL. And I'm sure if you Google Challey Institute NDSU, you can find the information as well. Dr. Smith is going to be giving a talk, and it's going to be worth your time to listen. And certainly thanks for your time on the show today.
Rob, thanks a lot.
Want more political news like this? Visit inforum.news/port to get 3 months of unlimited access to our news network for only 99 cents a month. Don't wait. Get this limited time offer at inforum.news/port now.